We're doing a project breakdown today, so I shared a recent documentary on the channel called Inside Outside. It's about Sam, a friend of mine, a visual artist, and his sort of creative philosophy and how he pulls ideas out of his head. We shot it really simply. We shot it on the Nikon ZR. We're going to look at the gear that was used in making this, but honestly, this is just one small piece of a much bigger picture. So we're going to look at all of the stuff that went into making a project like this. So how we shaped a narrative, decisions on how to shoot it on the day, and how we pulled stuff together in the edit in terms of using music and sound design, and then we'll also look at the grade too. So let's get into it. So this whole film is based around an Audiio interview which I recorded in my studio with Sam about a year ago, and I've just been sitting on it, waiting for the right time to set it to some visuals and make a film with it. I'm always interested in people. I'm fascinated by them. It's why I do this job. I love interviewing people, and it doesn't really matter what industry they're in. I'm just interested in, what motivates them, what's going on inside their head. How does that translate to what they do in the world? So Sam, I'm always inspired by his work and his philosophy on the world. And so I thought he'd be a great person to explore how he comes up with ideas in his head and gets them on the page, hence the title Inside Outside. I think audio-only interviews, generally they sound more intimate because there's no camera equipment in the way. People tend to be relaxed because they're not confronted with all the kit. And you tend to use better quality studio-grade microphones, or you can, like condenser microphones, which just pull more richness out of people's voices.
I think people think about artists as this kind of other species that's almost kind of semi-magical, and I think that's a bit of a myth.
And I think with the right editing, it helps to position your interviewee, your subject, as more of a narrator in the film without them necessarily having to, read from a pre-prepared script. So I knew that I wanted this piece to be a little bit more experimental, a little bit more abstract. We're talking about abstract ideas here. Where do ideas come from? The philosophy behind an artist's work. So I knew I needed to get a certain type of response from Sam. And I call this process fishing when I'm running an interview. And what I mean by that is that I'm really looking for specific responses, and I'm asking questions in a certain way, prompting him in a certain way until I get what I'm looking for. But I'm really looking for poetic descriptions, philosophical ruminations, that kind of thing. Having this all down early on also allowed me to start the process of finding music options. So for all the music and sound effects in this piece, I used the music library Audiio, who kindly sponsored the project and have also sponsored this video. Generally, the music is the thing that is most integral to shaping the edit. They have a huge, fantastic library of music, and they also have a great library of sound effects as well when it came to the sound design. I just started off by sort of searching through the catalogue. And then the great thing about the playlist feature with Audiio is that it also begins to recommend other similar tracks. And before long, you've got a really nice selection and playlist of possible music for your projects. I also loved using Hans AI, which is basically like a chatbot they have. So you can give it prompts about the types of music, the vibe, the type of project that you're looking for. And then it will give you a run of tracks that might suit that. And usually, with a project like this at the beginning, music discovery can be soul-crushingly slow, but Audiio's tools genuinely do help to speed this process up. And it makes it a lot less painful too. So usually for this kind of project, I would shoot it on the Komodo. And it's a great camera. I love that camera, but it's big and bulky. It chews through batteries. It needs big V-mount batteries, an external monitor, cables, a full rig. So with the Nikon ZR, I was just really interested about whether you could get similar quality, still capturing R3D, but without all that extra baggage. Shoot on an absolute stripped back setup. So no external monitor, relying on that beautiful 4-inch monitor on the ZR. Just a camera cage, so the excellent XLCS cage. And then I think just had a minimal top handle, and that was it. The lens package was the Thypoch Simera-Cs, which again are tiny and paired super well for this kind of minimal setup. We shot everything in 6K R3D with a mix of frame rates, everything from 25 to 50 to 100 frames per second. Everything was shot, I think, between the two base ISOs, mostly at ISO 800. And the ZR just performed perfectly across the day. It's not very power hungry, so I only had 3 batteries and we could rotate those on charge, and that worked absolutely fine across the day. But it does have one fatal flaw, and that's the data race. Across the day, even though we were only shooting B-roll, so no interview, we captured almost 2 terabytes. And this is what makes me so mad about this camera, because it is almost perfect in every other way for small considered projects like this. But those data rates shooting in Red RAW, where you're really getting the best out of this camera, just make it unmanageable for regular project work like this. I brought with me a tiny, also DJI RS3 mini gimbal and a TT Artisan 14mm lens to make use of autofocus when using the camera on a gimbal. We had some lights, but we'll talk more about lighting a bit later on. And also I need to note, on the day we had an absolute minimal crew, so it was just myself and my colleague Matt, who was working as my camera assistant for the day, and then obviously Sam. So having that interview in the can early on really helped me decide, okay, I've kind of got a rough pacing for this piece. It feels a lot slower, it feels a lot meditative. And so that went into informing how I was going to shoot stuff on the day. So that kind of meant, okay, I want to shoot stuff on a tripod. I want shots to feel more controlled, to hold for longer. I'm probably not going to shoot a lot of handheld stuff, not going to have a lot of sort of dynamic handheld shaky movement. And it informed my decision to instead use a gimbal for any movement that I wanted to introduce, because it just felt like a lot more controlled and a bit slower and allowed me to get sort of more intentional tracking shots rather than the more scrappy sort of handheld stuff I would usually do. And I really need to stress here how cool this setup is. We have a tiny gimbal, a tiny camera, and a tiny cheap 40mm lens with autofocus capturing in Red RAW, up to 100 frames a second, and all of this kit being used is incredibly affordable. I just think it's incredible where we are with filmmaking kit at the moment, and I think like the level of production value that you can get with this affordable setup is huge. And despite it being a really cheap lens, I think it's like $150, the autofocus held up really well, and it was just a really smooth process to operate this little setup. The content of the interview also fed into how we shot stuff, how we framed stuff. So Sam's obviously very introspective, he's very playful, he's very curious, so the visuals also have to sort of mirror that as well. And it kind of reminds me of a quote from David Lynch, it's actually from a character he plays in the film. And he's talking about landscape photography or landscape paintings, and he says something like, when the horizon's at the top, it's interesting, when the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting, but when it's in the middle, it's boring as shit. And that's always a quote that stayed with me. Like, there's the standard way of doing something, like a portrait like this is fine, but it's boring, it's normal. And that's not what this film is about, that's not what Sam is about. So I was always pushing myself outside of my comfort zone to go further and find the unique perspective on something. And these are the shots we went for. They're atypical, they're much more interesting. This portrait shot has much more headroom in it, it's more playful. And I think this is a really important learning point. It's not just the interview that tells the story, it's the way that you pair that with the visuals, the sound design, the music. All of these things will create a unique sense of personality in your work. Film is all about creative ideas, right? And so I wanted to bring people right into the place where the pencil meets the page, where the idea hits the page. So this was probably one of my favorite setups of the day. We rigged a magic arm with a pencil, chucked on some cheap diopters onto the front of the lens, and then just handed this over to Sam to get on and draw. And because the setup was so lightweight and small and agile, it was super easy for Sam to hold this rig and the pencil and just get on and do some drawing. And this is definitely something that just wouldn't have been possible on my Komodo setup. It would have been too big and bulky, it just wouldn't have been possible. And then the other thing to note about this is that I opted to shoot these sort of macro style shots on a wider lens rather than a tighter lens. So I think we went with the 21 over the 75. It was a much more interesting shot. I also use the excellent Zoom Control app on my iPad to control this camera remote control. So this is a new third-party app which has transformed how I've used this camera. And it's brought it more in line to how I use my Komodo with the Red Control app. And it just means you can remotely control the camera, you can monitor the image remotely, and it even gives you access to additional exposure and monitoring tools that you don't even get on the camera. It's fantastic. So the first few hours we're just capturing Sam working in the studio. The studio is filled with loads of natural light. So this is both a blessing and a curse. But the most interesting shot was clearly to shoot this way of the windows behind Sam, which meant dragging the exposure on the camera down to avoid blowing out the windows. And then that meant we had to push light onto Sam to balance for that. So this is where I used my Godox M600D, and we had a huge aperture softbox to get a nice soft key on him. And then the trick here was to really balance the lighting out. So it's just sort of lighting him, there's just a hint of it, and not making it look too overlit or artificial. And then outside of that, we were mostly just shaping and using natural light. So we had a soft silk diffusion frame, which we used to help diffuse the natural light throughout the day. And I've talked about this on the channel before. I think everyone should have one of these. They work so, so well. And it's just a great way of kind of like adding a softbox to the sun. And it produced this lovely, slightly warmer, softer light, which you can see on portrait shots like this. So in the middle section of the film, we're kind of exploring the inner landscape of Sam's mind. So to explore this, I knew I wanted something specific in terms of abstract visuals that played around with distortion and identity and sort of fragments of personality coming through. Because it's so introspective, I kind of wanted to really isolate Sam in darkness. So this was the final setup of the day. We had to wait till it got dark. We were still shooting in Sam's studio. So we used the dark side of a large 5:1 reflector as the backdrop to sort of black everything out. And then we had a Godox light panel above him and then a little Mollis X200 as a backlight. And then I also used a Zhiyun M40 mounted on the camera side to provide a bit of an eye light for Sam. And there's nothing complicated about this setup. I think I added some extra diffusion to the top-down light just to soften everything up. Sam had chosen to wear this yellow jumper and it just really allowed everything to pop. It really stood out from the darkness. And I think it really demonstrates the power of wardrobe and color here. Then to get these like warpy distorted shots, I'm just basically moving in an effects filter in front of the lens. I'll have a link to it in the description down below, but we also experimented with like other bits of glass from around the studio and also my eyeglasses as well. And the idea here was just to sort of experiment and play around with different styles of distortion. And I think if I was going to change anything in this setup, I probably would have preferred to have shot this a little bit wider, just to have an establishing shot of kind of like Sam surrounded by an abyss of darkness rather than this more sort of like tighter mid shot. But we were just working with the limitations we had available in Sam's studio and obviously the size of the backdrop. The other benefit of audio interviews is that you can record them before the shoot day. So because of this, I transcribed it, I chucked it in Resolve and started pulling out all the bits that I wanted. So I was looking for anything that sounded poetic, flowery, that's what I was looking for. And slowly, this structure and narrative begin to emerge and it sort of fell into 3 sections. So there was this intro, which kind of sets Sam up as the artist and his philosophy. And then we go into this more sort of abstract inner landscape, which is more meditative. It's more about where ideas come from.
Then begins to rain, and then those droplets begin to be something. I'll tend to one idea and I'll let it grow a little bit and I'll tend to another one. And that comes out as an artwork.
Final section in the film is really about where these ideas land on the page, how they land on the page, and there are some absolutely great responses from Sam here.
The drawing's drawing me, I'm drawing the drawing. These are the same things.
So a lot of the edit had already been started with the audio, of course, but the real work begins. Now we've got all the visuals and I'm just starting to lay stuff down. I'm also beginning to work in the music options, and that's when everything starts to come to life. Generally, the music is the thing that is most integral to shaping the edit at this point. So I'm trying loads of different options. I've done my music discovery and playlisting before the shoot day, so I've got a nice long list of music to work from. And I'm just swapping stuff in, and this process is super iterative and it takes ages, and I'm swapping music tracks in right until the last minute. So the beginning, it needs to be slightly driving, it needs to pull us into the film, but it needs to be slightly mysterious. And then the middle section obviously has to be quite ethereal and abstract as we go inside Sam's mind. And then that final section, I wanted it to be quite playful again, but also have a little bit more personality to interact with the kind of philosophical ruminations that Sam is giving us. I think the thing that took the most work was working on this kind of like middle section, the bit where we're sort of exploring Sam's inner mind, the inner landscape. This would just involve me experimenting with lots of different shots, but also layering different shots and playing with opacity, flipping shots round. And then for the final bit of this section, I had this very last minute decision to sort of overlay Sam's artworks over this portrait shot of him. I was a bit worried that maybe this was a bit on the nose. Maybe let me know in the comments down below, but I kind of liked it. So in the end, I left it in. Also introducing some sound design quite early on. And the reason why I do that earlier on rather than at the end is because it really just helps me get into the mood and set the tone, which I think then helps me kind of feel my way through this part and this edit and help sort of mold it in the way that it needs to be. And the idea here was to have this sort of sense of an ebb and a flow of sort of rising weather patterns and storms and static and stuff that was slowly cutting through and fading out.
From that, I found a lot of useful practices, your meditation practices, and that idea of exploring that inner landscape.
Finally, everything sort of broke through. Rain and thunderstorm happened to represent the kind of ideas pouring down. Sort of have a rough edit of the sound design, and then I'll leave it and come back to it towards the end. And I did the sound design for this project in Ableton, and that's where I really refined it, added to it, and sort of fleshed it out more. And then one other thing to note, I think in this final section, this is where the music really plays a more integral part in driving the edits.
Into form, and then that digestion of form back into the ineffable.
This piano piece where it just sort of ambles around and has its own like personality, and those piano notes are then basically informing where the cuts happen, and the cuts are happening on those harder notes.
I'm choosing to be taught by my artwork. I'm just a passenger.
And then the whole thing just begins to have this like lovely musical pacing to it. And it's also this music that is used to transition us through like a hard cut out of that more meditative section. And I really like how hard that cut is, because it's a bit like, you know, we're asleep and we're in this dream and suddenly we're awake and we're back in the studio. Okay, so for the color grading, it was a pretty simple process actually. For 80% of the film, I used my own Hackney LUT and power grade. We're working with R3D footage here. So it's available as both a LUT pack or a power grade that also comes with a LUT pack. And it's still on discount actually if you want to pick it up. But I would say 90% of the film was graded with that. For the sort of ethereal inner landscape stuff, I used this different power grade for this. Originally, I wanted to shoot this on film, but I just didn't get my act together. So I did the next best thing and emulated it in post. And for this, I used ZR's Film Vision Pro power grade. As I really like that, and it just gives you that kind of like those filmic colors, a little bit of dust and stuff on the grain, and I just wanted two sort of distinct visual treatments for these two parts of the film. But for the bulk of the film, using the Hackney power grade, for example, on this shot here, we'll have a quick look at what I did. This is the Rec 709 image as it comes out of the Nikon ZR. Typically, I find the ZR pushes a bit warm and has quite a heavy green tint. So I'd start off by applying my Hackney LUT. So we are using the Hackney Cool LUT here. And then I would probably go into my raw tab and just make a few white balance, tint and exposure adjustments to get the image sitting where I want it. And then I would start building my grade and look from that using the elements from the power grade. So I'll just quickly step you through what I was doing. So I'd of course add the LUT, and then if I wanted to do some more surgical exposure tweaks, I would go into my HDR wheels. I then might look at dialing in maybe a bit of contrast. I might pull out a little bit of saturation to help things look a little bit more natural. Then use my color density node to sort of give me slightly richer looking colors. I then might go in and just tweak the skin tone a little bit. And then just to finish it off, I would be looking at stuff like maybe I want to soften the image up, or adding the grain to add a bit more texture, and then adding a vignette just to sort of tie it all together. And that's about it really. It was super simple. Some shots I might have wanted to add some bloom, but I don't think I use this much across the project. So you can see I've done similar things here and also similar things here, maybe tweaking how I deal with the contrast a bit and boosting stuff like highlights a little bit. But the whole look has been built within my own power grade and using my LUTs. And that's what this power grade is designed to do. It's designed to give you this sort of sandbox to create your own looks. It doesn't really force a single look on you. It just gives you the tools to build out your own. think there's a lot to be said about working in this kind of quite agile and responsive way. So yes, we had a shot list planned and we had a schedule and a structure to the shoot day, but there was also enough time and flexibility left open to respond to ideas as they came up on the day. So there were tons of shots that obviously weren't in my shot list. And I know from experience from working on larger agency jobs where there's large crews, larger camera packages and loads of kit to move around, that they're a lot more difficult to respond to new ideas on the day than a project like this. And I think that's one of the advantages that you have working in a way like this over those larger, better resource projects, because you can just respond to stuff on the fly. And I think, you know, planning and shot lists and scripts and stuff, they obviously help you execute ideas on the day, but having that flexibility to be spontaneous and respond to ideas as they happen, those are the things that really make a film what it is. But yeah, thanks for watching, and that's it. My name's Ed. I'll see you next time. See ya.